January 1945. The eastern outskirts of Warsaw and further west, the frozen approaches to a shattered German fortress line, the Red Army is grinding its way through street by street, house by house, cellar by cellar. Leading the assault down narrow rubble-strewn avenues where a German Panzerfaust team can be waiting behind literally any window on any floor is a low, wide, brutally angular tank painted in winter white, its single enormous main gun making it look almost comically top-heavy compared to the vehicles rolling beside it. This tank carries barely 30 rounds of main gun ammunition, fewer shells than nearly any other tank fielded by any major army in the entire war. Its rate of fire is agonizingly slow, roughly 2 rounds a minute in the hands of an experienced crew, sometimes less. On paper, it should be a liability in exactly the kind of close-quarters urban combat it is being used for, a slow, ammunition-starved gun platform in a fight that rewards speed and volume of fire above almost everything else. And yet Soviet infantry commanders keep requesting more of these tanks by name, because when this particular vehicle's single shell hits a fortified building, the building generally stops being fortified, and when it hits a German tank at any range its own crew can actually see, that tank generally stops existing. Its name was the IS-2, the Joseph Stalin tank, and it represents one of the strangest trade-offs any nation made in the entire history of armored warfare, a machine deliberately built to fire less often in exchange for making absolutely certain that whatever it did hit would never need to be shot at twice. To understand why the IS-2 exists, you need to understand the very particular problem facing Soviet tank designers by the middle of 1943. The Red Army's existing heavy tank, the KV-1, had entered the war with genuinely formidable armor for 1941, thick enough that early German anti-tank guns frequently bounced off it entirely, but by 1943 that same armor was proving barely adequate against the newer generation of German guns, while the KV-1's mediocre mobility and unreliable transmission meant it delivered increasingly less protection for an ever-growing weight and mechanical burden. At the same time, Soviet intelligence and battlefield reports were delivering increasingly alarming news about what German industry was fielding. First, the Tiger I with its feared 88mm gun, and by 1944, worse still, the even more heavily armored King Tiger. Soviet commanders needed a tank that could kill a Tiger from the front at realistic combat ranges, something no existing Soviet gun could reliably do, and they needed it fast, without the luxury of years of careful development that German engineers had spent building comparably ambitious designs. The solution, driven through development by designer Joseph Kotin and his team at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, was built around a single ruthless piece of logic. Rather than try to match German armor thickness plate for plate, a race Soviet industry, still recovering from the catastrophic loss of its Western industrial base in 1941, could not realistically win, put the largest gun that could physically be mounted on a heavy tank chassis onto a hull with armor good enough to survive most hits, and accept the ammunition and rate of fire penalty that gun would impose as the cost of doing business. That gun, once Soviet engineers finished arguing over which weapon to adapt, turned out to be the A-19 122mm field gun, originally designed as towed corps artillery rather than a tank weapon at all, a piece of equipment so large that squeezing it into a tank turret required extensive redesign of both the gun's breech mechanism and the turret ring it sat inside. The resulting combination fired a shell heavy enough that a single hit from almost any angle could reliably destroy a German Tiger, Panther, or King Tiger, detonating ammunition stores, or simply shattering the crew compartment through sheer kinetic energy even when the round itself failed to fully penetrate. The trade-off was severe. The separate loading ammunition, shell, and propellant charge loaded in 2 distinct steps rather than a single unified round, combined with the sheer physical bulk of a 122mm shell in a cramped Soviet turret, meant a well-trained loader could manage perhaps 2 rounds a minute under ideal conditions, a rate that would have been considered dangerously slow on a medium tank fighting a fast-moving battle, but that Soviet doctrine increasingly accepted as an acceptable price for a weapon that essentially never needed a second shot to finish the job the first one started. The finished vehicle weighed approximately 46 tons in full combat trim. Considerably lighter than the German King Tiger, it was frequently compared to a deliberate choice that kept the IS-2 mobile and mechanically manageable in a way its German rival, chronically underpowered for its own mass, never quite managed. Frontal hull armor measured around 120 millimeters on the earlier cast nose design, later improved with a redesigned flat-plate glacis on production vehicles from mid-1944 onward that offered better effective protection through improved angling without adding significant extra weight. The distinctive cast turret carried armor in a similarly practical range, thick enough to resist the majority of German tank guns at typical Eastern Front combat ranges without chasing the diminishing returns of ever thicker steel that had made the King Tiger so mechanically fragile. Power came from a V2IS diesel engine producing around 520 horsepower. A reliable and relatively fuel-efficient design descended from the same engine family that powered the T-34, giving the IS-2 a top road speed of roughly 37 kilometers per hour, and crucially, an operational range considerably better than its chronically fuel-starved German rivals, a tank that could actually be relied upon to reach the battlefield under its own power, rather than running dry along the way. Crew numbered 4, commander, gunner, loader, and driver, one fewer than most contemporary heavy tanks, since the enormous 122 millimeter ammunition left little spare room inside the hull for a dedicated radio operator role that other designs typically carried as a fifth crewman. If you are finding this deep dive into the engineering and combat history of the Soviet Union's most feared heavy tank useful, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep making this kind of content. The IS-2 entered production in late 1943 and reached frontline units in meaningful numbers through 1944, immediately drawing attention from German intelligence for the sheer damage a single well-placed shell could inflict. Its combat reputation was built less on any single decisive tank battle. Direct IS-2 versus Tiger engagements were comparatively rare, given how thoroughly both sides had learned to avoid unnecessary frontal duels against heavy armor by 1944, and more on its role as the decisive tool in exactly the kind of grinding, methodical warfare the Red Army increasingly specialized in as it pushed westward across Poland and into Germany itself, particularly the brutal urban combat of assaulting fortified cities where a single shot from a 122 millimeter gun could collapse an entire building housing a machine gun nest or an anti-tank position that infantry alone would have taken hours and heavy casualties to clear. Soviet tank crews and the infantry they supported developed a grim shorthand for the weapon's effect on fortified positions, describing it less as an anti-tank gun that happened to also work against buildings and more as a demolition weapon that happened to also work against tanks, a role reversal from most contemporary heavy tank doctrine that reflected exactly how the Red Army had come to actually use the vehicle by the war's final year. The most demanding test of the IS-2's design came during the Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945, where Soviet forces faced exactly the kind of dense urban combat environment that had shaped so much of the tank's late war employment, but now compressed into the single largest and most heavily defended city battle either side had yet attempted. German defenders, increasingly relying on Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck infantry anti-tank weapons in exactly the close-range ambush conditions that Berlin's rubble-strewn streets provided in abundance, inflicted serious losses on Soviet armor of every type throughout the battle, and IS-2 units were far from immune, their slow turret traverse and painfully low rate of fire proving a genuine liability. Whenever a hidden Panzerfaust team got the first shot at close range before the tank's crew could locate and destroy the threat. Soviet tactics adapted accordingly, increasingly employing IS-2 units in close coordination with dismounted infantry specifically tasked with clearing buildings and covering blind angles ahead of the tank's advance, a partnership that traded some of the tank's independence for a dramatic reduction in the ambush vulnerability that had made urban combat so costly for armor of every nationality throughout the war. Where that infantry support held together, the IS-2's gun proved exactly as decisive against fortified German positions in Berlin's final defense as it had against similar positions across Poland and East Prussia the year before, methodically reducing strongpoint after strongpoint in a city where nearly every building had been converted into one. The IS-2's baptism of fire came earlier than its Berlin legacy might suggest, with early production vehicles reaching frontline units in time to see action during the massive tank battles that followed Kursk in the summer and autumn of 1943, though it was the type's continuous refinement through 1944 that turned it from a promising design on paper into the weapon Soviet commanders came to rely on for E-war's hardest fighting. The original cast-nose glacis, while reasonably effective, proved to have a weak point where the driver's hatch interrupted the sloped armor, a shot trap that German gunners learned to exploit whenever the angle allowed it. Soviet engineers responded in mid-1944 with a redesigned flat-plate glacis that eliminated the vulnerable casting seam entirely, trading a small amount of interior space for a meaningfully stronger, more uniform frontal arc, exactly the kind of continuous incremental improvement that characterized Soviet wartime tank development far more than any single dramatic redesign. This willingness to keep modifying a design already in mass production, rather than waiting for a perfect version before committing to full-scale manufacturing, stood in sharp contrast to the far more rigid, centrally planned development process that had left German heavy tank production perpetually chasing theoretical perfection at the expense of getting adequate numbers of vehicles to the front on any reasonable schedule. The comparison between the IS-2 and its most direct German counterpart, the King Tiger, fascinated tank crews and intelligence officers on both sides throughout the war's final year, and it remains one of the most frequently debated matchups in the entire history of armored warfare, precisely because the two vehicles approached an almost identical problem from such different philosophical directions. The King Tiger carried thicker frontal armor and a flatter shooting, higher velocity gun capable of engaging at longer range with greater accuracy, advantages that gave it a real edge in a hypothetical long-range duel in open terrain, the kind of engagement German heavy tank doctrine had always assumed it would fight. The IS-2 carried a considerably heavier shell, one that inflicted catastrophic overpressure damage on a crew compartment even without full penetration, mounted on a hull light enough to actually reach the battlefield reliably and be replaced in numbers the King Tiger's production bottleneck could never match. Soviet field reports and later technical assessments generally concluded that a King Tiger held the advantage in the specific scenario both sides' doctrine writers had originally imagined, a clear-sighted engagement at maximum range in open country. While the IS-2 held the advantage in the far more common scenario, both tanks actually spent most of the war fighting closer-range engagements in broken terrain, forests, or urban rubble, where the German gun's long-range accuracy advantage mattered less and the Soviet shell's raw destructive power mattered more. Neither side ever got the clean, decisive head-to-head comparison that post-war military enthusiasts have argued over for decades, since commanders on both sides increasingly avoided committing their heaviest, most valuable armor to unnecessary risk once both types had proven expensive and difficult to replace. Post-war Soviet and later Western technical assessments of the IS-2 reached a consistent verdict that mirrored, almost precisely in reverse, the honest conclusion reached about its German rivals. Where the King Tiger represented an engineering philosophy that chased theoretical dominance at the cost of practical reliability and sustainability, the IS-2 represented a philosophy that deliberately accepted a real and measurable tactical limitation, that agonizingly slow rate of fire, in exchange for a weapon that Soviet industry could actually build in meaningful numbers, actually fuel and maintain across the enormous distances of the Eastern Front, and actually trust to end almost any single engagement with its first shot rather than its third or fourth. Production reached roughly 3,800 vehicles across the war, a figure that, while far short of the tens of thousands of T-34 medium tanks that formed the backbone of Soviet armored forces, dwarfed the roughly 1,800 Tiger I and King Tiger heavy tanks Germany managed to build combined. A production advantage that mattered enormously in a war increasingly decided by which side could field replacement vehicles faster than the other side could destroy them. The IS-2's design lineage proved remarkably durable in Soviet service, forming the direct basis for the post-war IS-3. A tank whose dramatically redesigned pike-nose glacis plate and even lower profile influenced heavy tank design across the world for the following decade, and elements of the same 122mm gun philosophy, overwhelming individual lethality accepted in exchange for reduced rate of fire, continued shaping Soviet tank doctrine well into the Cold War. Surviving IS-2 examples remain on display at numerous museums and memorial sites across the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe today, frequently mounted as static monuments in the very cities the type helped liberate in 1944 and 1945, a considerably more common sight than the rare surviving King Tigers scattered across Western museums. Itself a quiet reflection of just how many more IS-2S Soviet industry managed to put into the field compared to its far more mechanically demanding German counterpart. Return to the shattered streets of a besieged German city, early 1945. A tank that carries barely 30 rounds of ammunition, that can fire perhaps twice a minute under the very best conditions, that offers no meaningful advantage in a fast-moving open battle against a well-handled enemy formation, grinds forward through rubble that has already swallowed faster, more heavily armed vehicles from both sides of the war. Every criticism of the IS-2 was accurate and understood by the very commanders who kept ordering more of them built. Its rate of fire left it dangerously exposed in exactly the kind of close-range ambush its own infantry escort existed specifically to prevent. Its ammunition capacity meant a single sustained engagement could leave a crew with nothing left to fire at all. Its four-man crew, one fewer than most comparable designs, left every remaining man doing more work under greater strain than counterparts in other armies enjoyed. And yet, in the specific brutal arithmetic of the war, the Red Army was actually fighting by 1944 and 1945, a war of fortified cities, entrenched strongpoints, and German heavy armor that needed to die in one shot. Because a second shot rarely came in time, it worked exactly as its designers intended. It was never built to win a fast tank battle in open country. It was built to make absolutely certain that whatever stood in its way, a tiger, a bunker, or an entire fortified city block, needed exactly one shell to stop being a problem, and for that single brutal purpose, across the last 2 years of the war's bloodiest fighting, it never stopped delivering.